Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session today on morality compliance and navigating moral wriggle room. My name is Paul Bohm. I'm a senior advisor at the Commonwealth Treasury in the Tax Framework Division. Our division is particularly interested in the way in which people respond to the tax system, the incentives that the tax system creates for them, and how these play out across the economy. I would suspect for a lot of the public policy makers in the room, those themes are very general to your work as well. Understanding why people make the decisions they do, and then how that plays out in the space of policy we all deal with. This session will explore, as I've touched on, why people make decisions that are at odds with what they might otherwise consider right or responsible. Our speakers today will look at the psychology that guides the decision-making process, issues around collecting the data needed to address some of these policy challenges, and then the ATO will give us a bit of an insight into how they're using some of these things to improve taxpayer compliance and engagement. We'll hear from each of our three speakers in turn and then have opportunity for some Q&A at the end. So with that, our first speaker is an Associate Professor of Organisational Behaviour at the London Business School. Previously, he's taught at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University and was a Fellow of the Edmund J. Safra Centre for Ethics at Harvard. He's a PhD in social psychology from Stanford and has undertaken research into the psychological processes that allow people to act in an unethical way without necessarily feeling unethical. His work appeared across a range of prestigious journals and in media such as the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, and the Atlantic. Would you please welcome me? Please join me in welcoming Daniel Effron to the stage.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Daniel Effron. I am a social psychologist by training, and I spend a lot of time designing experiments to understand how people make decisions about ethical issues. And today I want to share a few insights from those experiments, some of which I've conducted, some of which my colleagues in the field have conducted. So how do people make decisions when ethics are at stake? Well, a naive view, as a starting point, is that they think about what do they stand to gain from doing something dishonest? What's the likelihood they'll get caught? And if they do get caught, how much will they be punished? Right? So in this naive view, the question on the top of people's minds when they need to make a decision about, let's say, inflating their expense reports at work, the question on the top of their minds is, can I get away with it? And if people answer yes to this question, they'll cheat. Today I want to claim that this view is overly naive and suggest a slightly more nuanced psychological take on how people make decisions like this. So I want to claim that the average person actually cares a great deal about feeling and appearing virtuous. And yet sometimes all of us face temptations to act in ways that could seem less than virtuous. And by understanding how people try to balance these competing forces, the desire to feel like a reasonable human being and the desire to get something good for ourselves, even if it means cheating, by understanding how people balance these competing forces, we can gain insight into when and why people are likely to cross ethical lines. So in this view, the question on the top of people's minds when they face an ethical decision is not, can I get away with cheating? But it's, can I do what I want in this situation without feeling or appearing like a bad person? So let's take this psychological framework as a starting point. And from there, we can look at a few different behavioral insights about the psychology of ethical and unethical behavior. So I'll go through each of these in some detail. So first, people cheat less than they can get away with. Second, when people have a fixed number of opportunities to get away with cheating, they're more likely to cheat at the very end. And three, sometimes doing good stuff can make us feel like we have a license to do some bad things. So let's start with this first insight. Imagine that you sign up to participate in a laboratory study. You go into the lab, you fill out some surveys, and then at the end, you're told that you can win a financial bonus for your participation today. The amount of the bonus will be determined randomly by the roll of a die. So here's how it works. You go into a private room and you roll a die under a cup with a little hole cut in the top. Right? You roll the die, you look into the cup, and you see what you rolled. And if you say that you got a higher number, you get more money. You can win up to $6 US. Yeah? Now you're looking through that little hole in the cup, and you see that you've rolled a 1. What do? Well, you realize pretty quickly you can cheat, right? No one's going to catch you if you say that you actually got a 6. Yeah? So what do? You say that you rolled a 1. Are you honest? Do you say you got a 6 and maximize your outcome? Or do you cheat a little bit, but not to the maximum extent possible? Well, this kind of study has been done with thousands of people in hundreds of laboratories, maybe dozens of laboratories around the world, many different countries. The finding is that the average person will cheat, but not to the maximum extent possible. What's going on here? Well, people are trying to balance these two competing forces. On the one hand, I don't want to settle for the lowest amount possible. But on the other hand, I would feel like a terrible person if I said 6 when I didn't really get a 6. So I'll cheat a little bit, kind of balance these forces. So one question you could ask is, $6 isn't that much money. Are people sensitive to the amount of money that they can win in tasks like this? It's a hard question to answer because our research budgets are constrained. Like we can't run these studies where you roll a die and you can get $1 million. But we can vary the stakes. And a recent analysis looked at the many studies that have used tasks like this around the world and plotted the results on this graph. So here, the y-axis is the amount of cheating. And I forgot to mention, how do we know that people are actually cheating in this task? Right? Because we can't observe what they've actually rolled. Well, we can't tell whether any individual is cheating in these particular tasks, but we can figure it out statistically. Right? So if we go back here, if everyone's being honest, the average person should say that they rolled a 3.5. Should be the average. Right? But if people say they did more than that, then some people are cheating. So back to this graph. The y-axis here is the amount of cheating. It's scaled so that 0 on this scale means no cheating, and 1 indicates the maximum cheating possible. Some of these studies are done with die rolls, some are done with coin flips. And the x-axis is the maximum amount of money you can get from cheating to the extreme. And in these studies, the amount ranged from 10 US cents to $50 US. So it's a large range. It's a 500-fold increase, even though our research budgets mean we can't go much higher than $50. So let's look at the results from a number of different studies. So each dot is a group of participants in a different study. Larger dots mean a study with more participants. This line is kind of the average. There are a few things to notice. So first, people cheat. Almost all the dots are above 0. Second, people aren't cheating to the maximum extent possible, and they're not even getting close on average, right? So the average amount of cheating is, it looks to me like it's around 25%, a little bit more of what they can do. And the third thing to notice is that people aren't that sensitive to the amount that they can win. So there appears to be a little kind of puzzling hump around $30 or $40 that quickly goes down, right? But on average, people are cheating not to the maximum extent possible, kind of regardless of how much they can win. So the punchline here is people cheat less than they can, even when the stakes increased 500-fold. So a few implications of this. First, I think people cheat less than we expect them to. I find these results surprising, and maybe you do too. This should give us pause when we're thinking about implementing interventions that are very costly, aimed to ensure that no one is able to cheat. Right? It's possible that if we left people to their own devices, yeah, there would be some cheating, but not as much as we expect, and maybe the cost to us of that cheating would not exceed the costs of perfect monitoring. In fact, I heard a couple days ago, and I should say I haven't been able to verify this, but I heard a couple days ago that Google introduced a new policy for its expense reports. When employees travel to new cities, they're given a cap on how much they can spend, but their expenses aren't verified. No receipts are looked at. Because Google figured out, yeah, maybe some people will cheat, but not that much, and it's more costly to pay administrators to go through all the receipts and check everything. That's the first behavioral insight. People cheat less than they can get away with. The second behavioral insight comes from some of my own work. And it starts with the observation that sometimes people have a fixed number of opportunities to get away with cheating. And they know how many opportunities they're going to have. So maybe the manager is away for 5 days, giving the cashier 5 opportunities to steal a little bit from the till without anyone noticing. Maybe a contractor on a fixed-term contractor will submit 4 invoices by the time the contract is over and realizes that no one ever checks these invoices. So that provides the contractor with 4 opportunities to overbill for his or her work. Or maybe a tax policy is going to change in the coming tax year, meaning that something is going to be monitored that previously wasn't monitored. Maybe that means that this tax year is kind of your last chance to get away with exploiting a loophole or doing something that you're not supposed to without getting caught. So we know from this previous research I talked about that if people have a fixed number of opportunities to cheat and get away with it, the average person will take some of those opportunities, but not all of them. So my colleagues and I wondered, could we predict when people are going to cheat, when they know how many opportunities they'll have? And we predicted that people are more likely to cheat when it's their very last chance to do so. So why would this happen? First, I want to point out, we're looking at situations where you can get away with cheating in all of the cases. So it's not like people think they're more likely, or sorry, it's not like they think they're less likely to get caught on the last chance. What would be going on psychologically that would lead people to take this last opportunity to cheat? Well, foundational research in social psychology tells us people want what they can't have. When opportunities are scarce, we want them more. I don't even know what a store is selling, but when I walk past a sign that says, "Get yours now while supplies last," I know I want it. Right? So people want what they can't have. They want what's scarce. Cheating opportunities provide an opportunity to get something good for yourself. And by definition, those opportunities are scarcest when it's your last one. So people should be more tempted to seize those opportunities for gain when they think it's their last chance to do so. And they should anticipate that if I let that golden opportunity pass me by, I'm really going to kick myself. So in short, I'm arguing that people are willing to cheat in order to avoid regret. My colleagues and I have tested these ideas in a number of studies. I'm going to take the time just to show you one today. And what this study will show you is that, look, people are trying to balance this angel and this devil, right? They're not cheating all the time, but the devil wins out at the end. OK. In this study, we recruited participants in London at the behavioral lab at London Business School. And we hired them as temporary research assistants. We gave them a typical research assistant job. We gave them some essays that had been written by participants in a previous study. We said, we want you to evaluate these essays on a variety of dimensions. Read the essay, fill out some rating scales. Okay? And as is typical with research assistant work, we'd paid people based on how long they took, based on how long they told us they took. Right? People can self-report the amount of time they spent. We said they would make 10 pence per minute. And after each essay that they had evaluated, they told us how long it had taken. Now, importantly, we never actually meet these people. We recruited them online. They're doing this work in the privacy of their own homes. They're not interacting with us. So it's not like we're standing there with a stopwatch over them. Okay? We tell them, look, we're not standing there monitoring you. We're counting on you to accurately report your time. Please be honest. So we make ethics very salient in this situation. So what people don't know is that we have a timer on the web page where each essay is embedded. So they don't know it, but we can tell how long they actually took coding each essay. So we can see if they're overbilling us for their time. We can take the amount of time they said they took and subtract the amount of time they actually took. So we have a measure of overbilling. Importantly, we kind of probe people for suspicion at the end of the study, and no one guesses that this is the case. So they really think they can get away with this. They can't be caught. Now, what we're interested in is how much people overbill us on the 7th essay. we randomly assign people to one of two experimental groups. For one of the groups, we say, you're going to complete 7 essays. You're going to do 7 tasks. And in this group, essay number 7 is the last one. In the other experimental group, we say, you're going to do 10 essays. In this one, number 7 is not the last one. So if people cheat more at the end, we should see more cheating on essay number 7 when they think it's the last one than when they don't. Okay. So the y-axis here shows the number of seconds that people overbuild us for their time. And so first, let's look at how much they overbuild us for the 7th essay. Just as expected, people overbuild us more when they thought essay 7 was the last one than when they thought essay 7 wasn't the last one. And that represents a 42% increase in how much they're charging us. Now, it's not just the case that expecting 7 essays led people to overbill us more overall. We don't see the same effect of experimental group on the first 6 essays that people did. So really, they're just cheating more at the end. We've also run this study in a paradigm similar to the die roll task, except in this one, people are flipping coins in private. Okay, so either they're faced with a binary decision about whether to cheat or not. We've done this with lots of people, giving them over 24,000 opportunities to cheat. We find overall that the odds of cheating are almost 3 times higher on the last opportunity compared to earlier ones. So there are a few implications of this cheat at the end effect. One is that if you're changing the rules so that it's going to be harder to cheat in the future. So for example, if a new regulation is going to increase monitoring of a certain unethical behavior, don't tell people that you're about to do this, right? Because it means that, that they're running out of time to cheat and get away with it before the laws or the rules get more stringent. Of course, it's not always practical to do this. In that case, I would suggest increasing monitoring towards the end. Right? So it's often costly or difficult to monitor people to make sure that no one cheats. So you want to deploy these scarce resources carefully. I would argue deploy them when cheating is most likely, and the research suggests that's when people feel like it's their last chance to get away with it. So that's the second behavioral insight. The third is that doing good stuff can free people to be bad. So I started the talk by mentioning that we're often torn between the desire to feel like a reasonable human being and the temptation to do or say something that could make us feel or appear less than virtuous. And I argued that we ask ourselves this question to decide how to act in these situations. Can I do what I want in this situation without feeling or appearing like a bad person? How do people answer this question? Well, one thing they do is they look back to their behavioral history, to their moral track record, for evidence that attests to what a good person they are, or really evidence that rules out the possibility that they're of bad moral character. If we can find evidence of this, we might feel more comfortable acting in less than virtuous ways in the future. If I'm considering whether to inflate my travel expenses, I might think back to that time last week when I dropped $1 in a homeless person's cup. I might say to myself, see, that proves that I'm not an awful human being, so I can give myself permission or license to inflate my expense reports. A little more formally, when people can point to past demonstrations of their morality, they have what researchers call moral credentials, evidence that they're a reasonable human being. And with these credentials in hand, they feel like they have a license to act in less than virtuous ways without feeling or appearing too awful. So the first demonstration of this moral licensing effect was in 2001, and since then, my colleagues and I and other researchers have found a number of examples of this. So for example, when people are given an opportunity to reflect on good deeds they've done in the past, they become less likely to give money to charity at the end of an experiment. When you give people an opportunity to say that hypothetically they would purchase environmentally friendly products, they become more likely to lie, cheat, and steal from the experimenter. This moral licensing effect is not even limited to the domain of morality. You hear it a lot of time with people who have health goals. So I've found in some of my own research that asking people to think about kind of the good behavior that they've done over the past week to achieve their dieting goals makes them commit to less ambitious dieting goals for the subsequent week, and then actually become less likely to follow through on those commitments at the end of that week. Perhaps a little bit more sobering is a lot of research that's been done in the area of race and racial discrimination. When people feel like they have established non-racist credentials, they feel like they've proven that they're not racist, they become more comfortable expressing ambiguous views that could seem racist. And I thought I would dive into this last example with a study that I conducted about a decade ago now. This is a study I did in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for the presidency in the US. At the time, I was a grad student on the Stanford campus, which is overwhelmingly liberal and supports Democratic candidates. And my colleagues and I went around surveying people on the campus. And half of them, we asked a very simple question. We said, who are you going to vote for in the upcoming election? Now, because this is an overwhelmingly Democrat-leaning campus, virtually everyone said, I'm voting for Obama. The other half of people, in a different randomly assigned experimental group, we asked them, who would you have voted for 4 years ago in the previous US election? At that time, John Kerry was the Democratic nominee for president, and not surprisingly, virtually everyone said, well, I would have voted for Kerry 4 years ago. What we thought this manipulation would do is allow half the people to identify themselves as supporters of an African American candidate. This half of our participants might feel like they had non-racist credentials, like they had proven that they're not racist. If I was racist, I wouldn't support Obama. So then the question becomes, what would these credentials allow people to do? Well, we asked everyone a difficult question. We said, imagine you are the chief of police in a small town, and your job is to hire a new officer. You need to find someone who has a great deal of honesty, integrity. Oh, by the way, there was an African-American police officer who used to work for this police force, predominantly white town, and this officer quit complaining of hostile working conditions. So there's some evidence that this could be a racially hostile work environment. Now, here's the question. Do you think this job is better suited for white people, for black people, or do you think race shouldn't be a factor in this decision? We thought this question would make participants squirm. On the one hand, some people might be tempted to say that the job is better suited for white people than for black people. Maybe they have a racist reason for doing that. Maybe they have a legitimate reason for doing that. Some people might argue that a black officer would underperform or feel really uncomfortable working in a racially hostile work environment. But on the other hand, you're not supposed to go around saying that you think jobs are better suited for one race or another. At best, it's politically incorrect. At worst, it could feel or seem racist. So what do people do when we ask them this uncomfortable question? So the y-axis here is the percentage of people who say, yes, I would prefer to hire a white person for the job. Almost no one says they would prefer to hire a black person for the job. So really, they either say, I want to hire a white person, or race should not be a factor. Well, remember the half of participants who I gave them a chance to express their political views by endorsing a white presidential candidate. Almost no one says that they want to hire a white person for this job. Okay? Most people go with the safe answer, and they say race should not be a factor. What about people who could establish non-racist credentials by expressing their support for an African American candidate? Well, now, about half of people say, you know, I kind of want to hire a white person for this job. White people are better suited for this job. So what's going on here? Well, we expect that ordinarily people are tempted to express this view, but they're inhibited. Right? They don't want to feel or appear prejudiced. But when they can identify themselves as non-prejudiced, because they support Obama, so they feel, they become disinhibited and they can express this view. It's kind of like how people say, oh, you know, some of my best friends are X, and then they tell a joke that seems offensive to X, whatever group X may be. Okay? Great. So a few implications of this moral licensing effect. So remember, this isn't just about race. It's been shown in a lot of ethically charged domains where doing good things can make people feel licensed to do things that could be perceived as bad. Well, one implication is that we need to be really careful when we intervene to try to improve ethical behavior. Even if these interventions are successful, when people start acting more ethically in one area, they may feel like they have a license to relax their ethical standards in other contexts. One example of this that comes to mind is an intervention a few years ago to reduce energy consumption in homes. The intervention was successful. People used less energy. Turns out they started using more water. There are a few explanations for this, but a moral licensing explanation suggests people feel good about all the environmentally friendly things they're doing with electricity, so they feel licensed to take a longer shower. So what can we do to combat this moral licensing effect? I don't have that much time to get into it, and unfortunately, to be honest, the research is a little messy here. We don't really know. But one recommendation is, if you want to improve ethical behavior, focus people on their commitments to ethical values, rather than just good deeds that they've done. When people have just done good deeds and they feel like they've made progress towards an ethical goal, it's easier for them to feel like they've ticked the box. I've done my good deed. I don't have to worry about that anymore. But instead, when people are focused on the ethical values that they really care about, particularly those that they've made public commitments to, they should feel obligated to act more consistently with that, and their ethical behavior should improve in the future. So today I've shared 3 behavioral insights with you from the fields of moral psychology and behavioral ethics. People cheat less than what they can get away with. People are more likely to cheat when it's their last chance. And doing good can sometimes free people to be bad. And so I hope to have introduced a slightly more nuanced psychology surrounding the way people make decisions that are ethically charged. People don't just ask themselves, can I get away with it? Instead, they ask themselves, can I give in to temptation in this situation without feeling or appearing like a terrible person? And by understanding how these dynamics, this fight between angel and devil, can play out, hopefully we can gain more insights into when and why people are likely to cross ethical lines and what we can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. There's some great insights there, I think, for all of us, which we'll delve into the questions at the end. Moving on to our second speaker. Our second speaker today is an associate professor at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods and the director of the Policy Experiments Lab. He's a fellow of the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute, a senior fellow at the Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research. Prior to this, he held a number of roles in the methodology division of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. He has a Bachelor of Economics with honours from the University of Sydney and a Master of Education from Monash and a PhD in Public Policy from the ANU. To present on understanding consent to data linkage and survey refusal, please welcome Nick Biddle.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for essentially Dan for covering my literature review. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the fact that we're meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and thank Uncle Ray Davidson for the wonderful welcome to country which we received yesterday. I'd also like to extend my thanks and acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be in the audience today, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. So thanks for coming along to the session today, and thanks for the organisers for giving me an opportunity to talk and present some new results, as also reflect on the existing literature on this issue. So I'd just like to acknowledge also that I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Dr. Julia Talbot-Jones from Victoria University in Wellington, and also that the data linkage work is a collaboration with Associate Professor Ben Edwards, also from the ANU. So essentially my brief today was to talk about the application of morality to decision making and compliance in an Australian policy context. So I'm going to do that in two ways. First, I'm going to touch on what I see as 5 big policy challenges in the Australian context, and reflect on how an understanding or a better understanding of moral decision making might help in thinking through some of the policy implications of these environments, and also suggest some possible research in these areas. Now, these aren't necessarily the biggest policy challenges in Australia, but I think we'd all agree they're somewhere up the top of that list. I'm then going to talk about some empirical work that I've been involved in on a specific policy challenge that I think underpins much of what we've been talking about over these last few days, and that's trying to get accurate data about how people make decisions and what they take into account. So, what are some of the policy challenges that we might reflect on, building on the work which Dan has talked about? So one example is student loan debt. So for those who are here from overseas, Australia operates essentially in an income contingent loan system. You undertake university or vocational education and training, and then you pay back your student debt once your income reaches a certain threshold. So total unpaid student loan debt is now sitting at about $55 billion, and by 2021 is forecast to increase to about $75 billion, and around 1/4 of that is not expected to be repaid. So at the moment, repayment is required of borrowers whose salary exceeds, I think it's about $42,000 or in the low 40,000, and that threshold has came down over recent years. And that reduction in the threshold has invoked criticism due to the view that policy change unfairly targets low-income earners. And a second policy response is to chase overseas borrowers. So those Australians who undertook a degree in Australia and no longer live there. So those Australians undertaking a gap year or considering that tenure track position in the US and coming back to Australia, watch out. So all Australian graduates now living overseas and who have a debt will have to declare their global income to the ATO each year. And if it reaches a certain threshold, then you have to pay back some of your debt. So leaving aside the enforceability of this issue, the government also wants to encourage voluntary compliance from overseas borrowers, as well as borrowers in Australia who may be earning below the threshold, but have some capacity to contribute. And how can we do that, and should we do that? So one response, I think, is to think about the way in which voluntary compliance will interact with other aspects of the tax and transfer system. And that's where I think the work which Daniel's talked about can feed into. So there's already research in the area about how the way in which someone making a voluntary contribution contributes to the next decision which they have to make, which may be compulsory or may also be a decision about voluntary giving. But I think the context of an income contingent loan is very different and very specific. And as a good behavioural scientist, we know that specifics matter. So I think in thinking about this policy change, we need to reflect on how it's going to interact with other parts of the tax and transfer system. So in a sense, the benefits of encouraging voluntary compliance might be a softer approach, and it doesn't necessarily target low-income earners. But the downside is that moral decision-making around a voluntary contribution might crowd out either other volunteering or it might lead to cheating, as Dan has talked about. So in a sense, I have paid my HECS debt. Well, I have paid my HECS debt, but hypothetically. I'm thinking I've voluntarily paid my HECS debt, so I can claim a few extra things on my tax form. Or I don't need to contribute to that international aid charity, which I have been doing over the last few years. So reflecting on those interactions, I think, will not only get to how efficient that policy is, but also the unintended consequences of such a policy change. So Dan's already talked about diversity, but I think it's important to reflect on that in an Australian context. So you may have heard or seen similar quotes in the past that in Australia, only 8 chief executives within ASX 200 companies have a non-European background, or words to that effect. And that's leaving aside our universities, our government departments. In a sense, we don't have a very diverse senior workforce in Australia. That's not going to be a surprise to anyone here. So one of the recommended policy responses have been the introduction of quotas or targets to address this lack of diversity. But this policy mechanism is rarely viewed, at least in an Australian context, favourably, and it's also only a partial response. And this recommendation is also complicated by the fact that we don't really have good data on people's cultural background in order to implement the policy. BETA has contributed to our understanding of the way in which people make hiring decisions through some of their field experiments. And the ANU, our researchers at the ANU have also contributed through audit studies out in the private sector. But I think it would also be useful to reflect on Dan's work to examine at which organisation level the biases emerge to better understand both the intrinsic motivations behind job hires as well as the extrinsic motivation to undertake an ethical recruitment process. And also, more importantly, I think, to think about the points at which along the hiring process that ethical behaviour is more or less likely to take place. So the Obama study, which Dan talked about, found that individuals expressing support for Obama in one question was more likely to have a prejudiced view in subsequent questions. But there's also other research which shows that choosing an African American in a job selection task in the first round increases the propensity to discriminate against an African American in the second round. So it's the cumulative moral decision making in this context which I think is important. And most of our experimental data really focuses on the callback stage. So someone either getting an interview or not getting an interview. And that experimental finding is reasonably easy to construct. And at our university, for example, we have quite justifiably, we're held to account if our pool of interviewees doesn't have a gender or an age balance. But does me setting up an equitable shortlist of interviewees reduce my chances of hiring someone from a particular background in the next stage of that recruitment process? So understanding the different stages at which our recruitment takes place, I think, is quite important. So Dan's already talked about the rebound effect in terms of undertaking ethical behaviour in one form of environmental behaviour and the effect on others. And I think this is particularly the case to think about this in an Australian context. In an Australian context where the moral pressure to undertake ethical behaviour in terms of water consumption is tied to very different contexts and very different behaviour to other international contexts. We're helping out the farmers, and we know how in an Australian context, how central the land and rural issues are to our policy discussions. So as Dan mentioned, experiments have shown that when residents are exposed to information campaigns about one form of environmental decision making, that can increase consumption in another. So I think we need to think very carefully about these rebound effects and make sure that when we induce, in this case, flipping it around, when we induce moral decision making in terms of water consumption, that we also look at how that affects other forms of consumption. So obesity. We've already heard from Martin Parkinson about the policy challenge of obesity in Australia and elsewhere. Now, obesity is now considered one of Australia's leading health problems, and we've all seen the statistics around it. And hundreds of community initiatives have been established with the express purpose of trying to tackle both childhood obesity as well as obesity across the life course. And I think that shining a light on the intrinsic motivation of people's eating habits in the Australian context could help ensure that the policy design is firstly more effective, but more importantly that it doesn't have the unintended consequences which often come from using morality to induce a certain decision. So I've reduced my caloric intake, which means it gives me license to smoke or drink. So we think about this in our own context. We all know ourselves about the futility and often counterproductiveness of using moral pressure to exercise more or to eat more healthily. But I think insights from this area should really filter in to our policy response as well. So the final, example which I wanted to reflect on is a very specific policy challenge or a very specific policy environment around private schools and private healthcare. So Australia has a very unique publicly funded health and school system that is underpinned by a universal access principle, but over the last few decades, we have been moving to a two-tiered system where access to health and education, many people access health and education through private providers. And these private providers are heavily subsidised by government. Now the view is, or the stated policy purpose is that as long as the subsidies are lower than the per unit cost in the public system, this may save money. So someone goes to a private school, they get some subsidies, but it's less than what they would receive in a public school, and then everyone's better off. Now, particularly for education, which is in some ways a positional good, so it doesn't just matter what my education is, it matters what my education is relative to others, then there is still likely to be unintended consequences or negative externalities of encouraging people into one system over another. And the standard response has been to encourage choice on the demand side through scholarships or tax incentives for private healthcare, and to cross-subsidise the private system on the supply side. But I think what's really missing from this debate in Australia, though, at least empirically, is a really good understanding of why people choose the system that they do. So why do people choose the private education system or the public system? And why do people choose the private health system or the public system? And how that choice impacts people's other decision making. So with regards to education in particular, we don't actually have very good clarity across the population on what is the pro-social behaviour and how that affects people's decisions. So my kids, for example, are in years 2 and 5. I did have to think about that a little bit. And they're currently attending a public school. And I have very great public schools in the school system which I live in. But am I a drain on the public system? When I could afford the alternative. And am I not caring for my kids' education by not paying for them to go to what might be seen as a better education system? Or am I supporting the education of the less well-off population in the area in which I live by providing relatively advantaged peers to those in the public system and my social capital to the school? So what is the moral decision in that context? We don't actually know. And I think thinking about that can help us understand how people are making decisions. So the final bit of the final policy area which I'm going to talk about relates to data linkage and data consent. So how can we apply morality in decision making to understand data collection, and should we? So the first part of Cass Sunstein's Bill of Rights stated that nudges must be consistent with people's values and interests. But how do we know what those beliefs are? How do we know what people see as being in their own best interest or not? Partly we're reliant on revealed preference. We see what people actually do. But we know that revealed preference is highly affected by defaults and by framing. So we rely on stated preference. But stated preference relies very heavily on having high quality data and having data which is representative of the population. So historically, the challenges in eliciting survey responses from willing participants has really been around constraints of time and money. Now these are reducing as we're better able to undertake surveys online, as well as link people's data to multiple sources. But new challenges have emerged, particularly in terms of the way in which consenting to give data is viewed across the population. So this challenge has been exacerbated by organisations such as Cambridge Analytica and a general decline, I think, in trust in government. So and data is often collected by government, and the data collectors and the service providers are often conflated. So from a rational choice perspective, participating in surveys is really like voting. The individual benefits are close to zero. The time and cognitive costs are quite high, and the fines for not doing so, I used to work at the ABS, they're actually quite easy to get around. Don't quote me on that. But the social benefits, like voting, are actually quite high, and particularly from high quality surveys. So how do we get the right people or a diversity of people to undertake surveys? So those in Australia will remember the intense media scrutiny around the 2016 census and the use of linked data. For our international visitors, Google #censusfail and enjoy the anguished views of our Australian statistician. Essentially, debate around data collection and linkage of data affected the discussion around whether people should consent or shouldn't consent to give their information. And that's just one instance, but the graph on the left also shows, from the Pew Research Centre, shows that survey responses are falling across the world in many contexts. So how do we look at this empirically around the social desirability and the social aspects of consenting to data? So we used one source of data, LENA, which is a Life in Australia panel. In a sense, individuals are recruited to a panel, a group of individuals who through high quality probability sampling, and then they are invited to participate in each wave of the data collection and paid a small incentive when they do so. So at the time of our analysis, we have about 15 waves of data collection. Each wave takes about 2 or 3 weeks, and there's about 1 to 3 months in between each wave of data collection. So the point for this presentation is there is incentive to participate, but the option to vary that payment, that option varies across each waves. So there's a number of payment types. You can take your incentive as a gift card. I think it's Coles Myer. You can take it as PayPal, essentially as cash, or you can donate your incentive to a set of charities. And we know that from previous literature that incentives matter in terms of data collection. But what we don't know is how that interacts with pro-social behaviour. So importantly for this study, repayment options are sticky. So people are only asked whether they would like to vary their option around 2/3 of the time. So it's not random, but it is exogenous to the individual. So sometimes you're asked, do you want to donate? Do you want to take the money as cash? Other times you're just reliant on what you said a wave or two ago. So there's variation in both what you're asked as well as what you can select. So what this figure gives is the percent of people who are on the panel. Remember, these people have already consented to be on the panel. These are people who said, yes, I would like to do surveys. This gives the percent of people who refuse to participate in each wave. And as with most longitudinal surveys, the refusal rates have increased quite substantially through time. But what do we know about these refusal rates and that ability to donate your incentive payment or to have that option to vary your response? So there are 2 studies what I want to talk about today. The first relates specifically to consent to data linkage, and this study has been through the peer review process and will be made available through a Methods of Longitudinal Studies paper. The second study is not peer reviewed. This is the first time I'm presenting the results, so take that on board when you view the veracity of them. But I think they're still informative. So in wave 11 and wave 13 of the panel, respondents were asked hypothetically whether they would consent to their social security data, their education data, or their Medicaid data being linked to that survey. So this is in many ways a pro-social behaviour. You give your tax records or your social security records or your Medicare records, and we get a better understanding of how the population is changing through time and all the things which we do with survey data. Importantly, there was random assignment of whether individuals were asked to consent to the end of the survey, the length of the consent form, as well as the type of data which was linked. And we proposed 3 hypotheses for the analysis. So with regards to the first hypothesis, we did find a significant difference. So in particular, the more sensitive the data which you're being requested to consent to, the lower the consent rate. With regards to the last hypothesis, we found some pretty mixed results. Essentially, there's no real difference when you vary the length of this consent form, but there is difference when you vary the amount of time people have to read that consent form. But with regards to hypothesis 2, there was no association between consent to link data and then sample attrition. So we were worried about that effect of you've done something good, you've consented to link your data, and therefore next time we ask you to fill in a survey, you're less likely to do so. We didn't find any evidence for that. So consenting to link your data does not appear to give you moral license to not fill in subsequent surveys. We did, however, find interesting results with regards to the donations and refusal. So the second study looked explicitly at those at donations and survey participants. So there are a range of pro-social behaviours observed through LENA. So we asked people about their volunteer behaviour, but also, as mentioned, we asked people about whether they would be willing to donate some of their incentive to charity. So these are the hypotheses, and this is what we find. So we're interested in whether being asked to consent to data linkage decreases donations. Now remember, we varied that consent randomly, and although hypothetical, it does prime people for their data consent history and their understanding. We found no association. But remembering back to Cass Sunstein's fifth point in his Bill of Rights for nudging, there's we must not take things away from people without their consent. Now that's not quite what's happening in the survey in that you have consented previously, but there is agency with being asked to consent again prior to this current wave. So we would expect that being given control in one wave increases your willingness to participate in subsequent waves, and it does. So if a person is asked in wave 12, for example, whether they'd like to vary their incentive payment, then they're more likely to agree to participate in wave 13. We might be worried, though, that the decision to donate one pro-social behaviour crowds out staying in the survey. And we find the opposite, though. We find that donating your incentive payment increases your response to the subsequent wave rather than decreasing. So, what can we take away from what I think the literature on moral licensing or social desirability more broadly? So there are many instances where decision-making and the reporting of that decision-making is influenced by social desirability. And Dan's presentation highlighted the complexity of the literature and the importance of understanding reinforcing versus conflicting norms. But, and I guess it's part of the complexity, we can't assume that the values in one context translate into another. We need to be very specific about the particular context and not assume that they hold. I attended the session yesterday afternoon about next generation nudges. So just building on what Kate Phillips said about the policy design process, I think we need to for want of a better word, have an audit of the way in which our interaction with government is framed and whether things are framed as pro-social or not pro-social and the likely effects which they're likely to have. On the specific subject matter which I've talked about, there's ongoing reliance of policy and democracy on high-quality data, and recent examples of where the quality or use of that data has called into question or undermined the trust in that data. And that makes it harder to design defaults or other nudges that are welfare enhancing. And our view is that ongoing research and understanding how to bolster and not undermine the pro-social norm of completing surveys can improve the policy relevance of the data, as well as our ability to design policy which is welfare enhancing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for that very informative look into some of the policy problems we face and some ways we may want to approach them in the future. Our final speaker today is Assistant Director at the Australian Taxation Office's Dedicated Behavioural Insights, or BI unit. In the 2 years since being established, the unit has applied behavioural principles to over 180 activities undertaken by the ATO and has trained 20% of its workforce in applying these principles to their everyday work. This has significantly improved taxpayer engagement and their experience with the ATO. To present on how the ATO encourages honesty and compliance, would you please welcome Catherine Griffin.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to Biddle for the invitation to present today. I'll start by giving you some background around the use of behavioural insights in the ATO, and then I'll move on to a few examples of how we've used BI principles to increase honesty and encourage compliance. So the ATO began looking into BI in 2010. We've just been hearing about the good work that was happening in the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the UK Tax Office. And we started user testing and piloting and trialing BI principles in our debt correspondence as well. So as we saw positive results there in terms of the client reactions during the user testing and actual payment rates in the trials and the implementation, we expanded the use of BI across the organisation, and we eventually set up our dedicated Behavioural Insights unit in early 2016. Our unit has these 4 key strategies. So first of all, we developed a distributed model built around our small central unit of only 10 staff. We support about 150 practitioners across all departments in the ATO. They're our BI leads and our BI champions, and they identify their own opportunities and apply BI principles in their own work. We raise awareness and build capability by offering foundation, intermediate, and advanced level training. So the BI unit team members, we've developed and delivered info sessions and workshops and webinars to over 4,000 of our staff, and our BI leads and champions have then further done training in their own teams as well. We support that training with tip sheets, with a compendium of our completed activities, a regular newsletter, and also an internal quarterly reference group meeting. We share knowledge with domestic and international agencies, and it's been really great actually to see some familiar faces at BX and catch up with people. We've hosted a number of BI showcases since 2012, and that's been open to other agencies as well. We've shared our training materials and our compendium, and we've just recently joined an advisory board on a community of interest around BI for the OECD. And finally, our key role is to deliver this in-house consultancy service. So we provide advice to project managers across the ATO on how to apply BI principles to achieve a measurable behavioural change, and recommend and assist with the design and analysis of trials. So generally, we've been using BI in recent years to improve the client experience. We're trying to make it easier for people to do the right thing and harder for them not to. And most people do actually do the right thing, and I'm sure that includes everyone here, of course. I'll assume that most of you deal with the ATO probably once a year when you're lodging in your personal tax return. And a few ways that the ATO has applied BI principles to that process include making it easier for people to lodge their tax return by pre-filling My Tax, and I'll talk a little bit about that further on. Helping people get their work-related expense claims right, which I'll also discuss, and providing greater certainty for individuals as they complete their tax return by using personalized emails and text messages to let them know if we need a little bit more information or when their return is about to get paid. And some of the key principles that we use to encourage honesty and increase compliance are here. We're making it easy, we're using transparency, and we're looking at loss aversion. So I'll take you through a few examples of how we've used those principles. I'm sure you're all thinking about tax time starting 1st of July this weekend, how quickly you can lodge a tax return, hopefully get a tax refund. You may be aware that you can use My Tax, so that's our free online platform that you can lodge your tax return on for individuals and sole traders. To save you time, we do partially complete that tax return with financial information that's personalised to you. It's got the information that we get from your banks, your health funds, your employer, and other government agencies. And I should just note that all of the information is usually available by mid-August, so not all of it's available straight away. So if you wait just a few weeks instead of jumping right onto it on Sunday morning, then you're more likely to have everything in there, and you're more likely to get it right the first time. All you have to do then is just review the information that's come through and add any missing details. And I guess in addition to just making that whole process easier, because who really wants to deal with tax and have to lodge a lot of forms, it does encourage honesty, because we're taking away the opportunity for people to fill in a blank space with inaccurate information. And if you have something that's already pre-filled, it really takes a conscious effort and a conscious decision to go and say, well, I'm going to change what's already there. So, probably more likely to question, can I do this and still feel like a good person? This My Tax also delivers tailored messages to people as they're filling in their tax return around the deductions that they claim. So as individuals, we can claim deductions for expenses that we incur when we're earning our salary and wages. They're called work-related expense claims, and that could be something like buying a uniform or buying tools and equipment. Unfortunately, people sometimes claim a bit more than they're entitled to. So the ATO is using data and analytics to compare the amounts that people are putting into their tax returns with similar taxpayers. And then comparing that data only takes about 20 milliseconds, and then we can push a message to people if it looks like their claim is going to be too high. I'm sure no one here is going to ever receive a message like that, so just for your information, they say something like, your work-related deductions are high compared to your taxable income, and taxpayers in similar occupations and income ranges, so review your car expenses or review your self-education expenses or whatever it might be. About 170,000 clients got a nudge message like that in tax time last year, and that led to deductions being self-adjusted down to the tune of about $80 million. So people were actually correcting as they went. And not everyone would have had to correct their claim. You know, that might have been completely accurate for some people that they happen to have that expense. But for those where it might have been a little bit inaccurate, you know, the fact that we were able to draw their attention to something that we considered a risk and be transparent about that has affected people's behavior. And actually, just on my tax, it's important to note there that the BI unit didn't really need to get involved in terms of applying BI principles to those messages or anything. It's actually been our leads and champions and other staff across the organisation who've understood the principles and applied them in their own work, so they haven't needed to rely on us. I'm just staying with deductions. Over the years from 2011 to 2016, we've actually seen those work-related expense deductions grow by 15%. And there is some evidence that there's a propensity to overclaim, and that includes in tax returns that are prepared by tax agents, and the majority of tax returns are actually prepared by agents. And while individuals, they might be overclaiming small amounts, they might feel like it's not that big a deal, it's $50 or it's $100, it's not that big. The sum and that overall revenue impact can be significant, can be in the order of about $2.5 billion was the estimate in around 2016. So in 2017, we partnered with Biddle, and we encouraged amendments of incorrect work-related expense claims. Using a randomized control trial, we sent this letter to tax agents identifying clients who had lodged tax returns that had higher than expected work-related expense claims. There were over 2,000 tax agents in the group, and they were randomly allocated to either the letter group, the treatment group, or a no-letter control group. I'm guessing that the letter's a bit difficult to read here, so just to highlight some points. We've used transparency by highlighting that we do use data analytics to compare their clients' claims. We've brought out the availability bias, saying that those high-risk claims are actually more likely to be audited. And we've also tried to prime the tax agent to think of themselves as the client's trusted advisor, so they're being relied on to do the right thing and get the right result for the client. Now, the report on this project hasn't actually been published. It's due to be published probably in a month or so I can really only give preliminary results. But it does look like 17% of agents in the letter group lodged amendments, compared to just 1% of agents in the no letter group in the control group. And on average, the identified clients look to have reduced their claims by $191, whereas in that no letter group, there was an increase on average of $2. So overall, the identified clients have reduced their claims by about 2.2 million in this trial. Again, we focus on transparency here, so it's a fact that we can tell the tax agents, like, we know it looks like your client's claims are too high. That's prompted their behavior to go back and check and amend those returns. On a bit of a different topic, I'm sure you're all familiar with getting text messages from your doctor or your hairdresser or your personal trainer reminding you of your next appointment. The ATO also sends out a suite of text message reminders. These are more about payment, so reminding people to pay their debts on time. These messages have also been designed with analytic models, so we take into account people's current circumstances, such as whether or not they've got a payment plan in place, and also their previous behavior. So this example shows people who've received a message in a previous quarter and been reminded to pay their activity statement on time. When they actually did so, the next message comes along and we say thank you for your on-time payment, and just a reminder that the next due date is coming up. These preventative text messages brought in over $2.5 billion over the years from 2015 to 2017 from people that our analytic models have predicted would be likely to pay late or not at all. And again, it's really just making things easy for people to do what they need to. This last trial, it's another one that we ran with Biddle, and it was actually just published in the last few days on Biddle's website, so that's great. But it's where we tested emails to encourage participants in our deferred GST scheme to remain compliant. So that scheme allows import businesses to defer the payment of GST on their taxable imports into Australia until they've actually sold the goods. And that's really quite a significant cash flow advantage for those businesses. About 13,000 businesses defer $26 billion in GST payments per year. But to be on that scheme, you have to stay up to date with certain requirements. So you have to lodge digitally, you have to lodge monthly, you have to be up to date with all of your payments. This trial involves single entity DGST clients who were non-compliant. And the project team drafted a suite of emails. And we were basically testing the effect of an email reminder again. We tested a cooperative, kind of softer toned reminder against a more direct, harder tone reminder. and then also had a thank you and a revoke notification for people depending on whether or not they complied or didn't. The emails are actually included in that book of case studies that everyone received in their pack, so you can go through and see what we actually wrote for everyone. But the team randomly selected about 1,200 clients that were non-compliant, and we allocated them to these 3 groups. The control group self-complied, they got no email, but they complied to about 33%. If they got the cooperative reminder email, then the compliance increased to 43%. And if they got the direct reminder email, compliance increased again to 46%. Having said that, the actual difference was not statistically significant between those 2 emails. So we feel that it's just the reminder function that has mattered, less so than the actual tone. We have rolled out the direct emails in our business as usual processes now, so that's gone into implementation. And due to the success of this trial, we're actually looking to trial the effect of sending similar reminder emails to GST groups. So this is groups where they have members on the DGST scheme. If one member is non-compliant, it actually means that all of the members can be revoked. So we're looking at incorporating principles around altruism into those emails. We are always happy to talk about the work that we're doing. We're happy to hear about what other BI practitioners are doing. So I'd just like to say that if anyone wants to get in contact, you can get to us on the mailbox. Thanks very much.
Thank you for that, Catherine. We'll bring the panel up now and have a fair bit of time for Q&A, recognising that we are keeping you from lunch. Perhaps I might use my prerogative and start the questioning off, drawing a bit of a narrative through line through all of those presentations, perhaps overly simplistic, but it's clear there's a lot to learn from understanding the way people's morality affects their compliance decision and the way they choose to interact with the system. Now, Nick, you touched on some of the issues around collecting the data and the way you use it, but I wonder if the panel has views on other issues that stop us from taking some of these very valuable insights and turning them into things like what Catherine presented. Maybe start with you, Daniel.
Yeah, barriers that prevent the translation of research into practice,
Yes.
Right? Well, one challenge is it's difficult in the real world to know who's cheating and who's not, and a concern with interventions designed to reduce cheating is that you're also reducing the number of people who are able to honestly, legitimately engage in their behaviors. It's very abstract, so let me give you an example. I worked on a trial with a UK police force where the goal was to try to reduce fraudulent reports of mobile phone theft. So apparently in this area of the UK, someone would want a new iPhone, so they would call up the police force and say, my phone's been stolen, could I have a crime report number that I can give to my insurance company? The insurance company would pay out, and then they would get a new phone for free. So we were trying to design a trial to reduce people from doing this. But the risk is that anything that makes it more difficult for people to dishonestly lodge this report could also prevent people from honestly saying my phone has been stolen. And the negotiations with the police force and them legitimately saying, we want to make sure that we don't prevent anyone from legitimately reporting this, made it quite difficult to do the trial in practice, and we actually didn't get it off the ground in a way that we wanted.
Nick, anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, I think Dan's kind of scales of costs and benefits, I actually do think underlies most of our assumptions on policy. So we kind of assume rational decision making still, so that it's very hard to conceptualize when people are going to make decisions which are against their own self-interest. But I also think, and what I tried to touch on is the heterogeneity and what is the social norm and what's not the social norm, I think, complicates kind of using our understanding of morality in decision making. So some of the examples which we might think of as policymakers or as researchers as being socially desirable others might think as being socially undesirable and vice versa. So having a good understanding of how that varies across the population and therefore how you can incorporate that variation, I think it would make it easier to incorporate this into kind of policy design.
And Catherine, anything potentially you see from the ATO?
I guess I would just kind of agree with what Dan was saying, that we can't go back and audit everyone, for example, in the work-related expense claims example that I was talking about. So we don't know if people adjusted because they were actually incorrect, or because they just made a mistake, if it was actually fraudulent, or because they were scared that, oh, I didn't know the ATO was looking at me and maybe I've done the wrong thing. So I guess we just need to kind of keep trialing and testing the kind of intervention to see how we go, but we can't be 100% sure. Yeah, and I guess another thing that we're talking about actually with Dan just earlier was that where we've sent the letter to the tax agents and asked them to review their clients' claims, we think that at least that idea of fear of dealing with the ATO is probably less likely to be a factor. So if they've amended, it's because the tax agent themselves is probably more sure that it should be amended, I guess, more so than the individual who may not be as experienced.
Okay. So do we have any questions from the floor? Yep, we'll start up the back here.
Hi, Miranda Logan
Just
from the Department of Home Affairs. Thanks so much for the presentation this morning. I think it presented a lot of very interesting questions. But when you pose the question that people think to themselves, is this going to make me feel like a bad person? I wondered if you had either any data or hypotheses on the impact of how severe or how public punishment might be, and whether there have been a particularly large public disgrace in the area, whether that makes someone either more conscious that might get picked up, or in fact say, well, my breach is pretty small, so that gives me a bit more moral license.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. In the talk, I placed emphasis on people's concerns about feeling less than virtuous, because I think that's particularly surprising and interesting. We can show in experiments that even when the chance of getting caught or punished or publicly shamed are basically zero, people still don't cheat as much as they could because they want to feel like a good person. At the same time, you might have noticed that in the way I was talking through some of this, I'd say, well, people want to feel and appear virtuous. And you're absolutely right that concerns about public shame are a huge disincentive. And I think that these different concerns often work in tandem. People don't want others to think poorly of them, and they don't want to feel badly themselves. So I would predict that even though you can get moral licensing effects in contexts where the only audience is you, that these effects would be stronger in situations where you have to convince another audience, an external audience, that you're a reasonable person. Thanks.
Other questions just here?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Rayner from the ACT government. Catherine, I was wondering in particular, and maybe it's a question for all of you as well, if you have any thoughts about the effectiveness of interventions that pull or push on morality when people know that that's what you're trying to do. And your letters on business expenses are particularly interesting, because I did actually get one of those letters from you guys and immediately looked at it and knew exactly what it was, which got me thinking about how effective a letter like that would be in a context where you could see right away what it was and what the ATO was wanting you to do off the back of it. So do any of you have thoughts about how is it a requirement that people don't know you're trying to influence their morality in order for this stuff to work?
I don't know. I'd say from the tax perspective that you have to be unaware that we're trying to pick up on the fact that we think there might be an error there, because it's still making it salient to you that, well, we do know something, like we have picked up a risk, and there are generally potential penalties with the ATO for putting through something that is incorrect. So for us, even though you might be aware of it, I guess we still think you can then think about, well, maybe the cost benefit a little bit, but what am I willing to continue to risk? Not saying that you thought that way, sorry. But I think for the ATO, it's still worth it to us as well to keep trialing and testing the impacts of that kind of a nudge or a message.
I really like the question. Cass Sunstein said in one of his addresses that transparency in what you're doing with nudges is really important. I totally agree from an ethical perspective. From an empirical perspective, I think your question brings up, it's really important to test whether awareness that you're being nudged, whether that eliminates the effectiveness of the nudges or not. And my intuition says that that's going to depend a lot on the specific nudge being used. With regards to the question of whether these these nudges that are targeting ethical behavior, whether those can work even if people know that they're being nudged, my intuition says that they might work better if people know that they're being nudged. The reason is that there's research suggesting that one reason why people engage in unethical behavior is they sort of forget that ethics are relevant in the situation. It's a phenomenon that psychologists call ethical fading. So the metaphor is that there's like a bright ethical line, and you tell yourself, I'm never going to cross that line, bright line in the sand. But as you get closer to it, it gets dimmer until you're on the other side and you don't even notice it. So for example, in a business organization, you might think of a particular decision as, well, this is just a business decision, and not even consider the ethical dimensions until you've crossed that line. So if you have an intervention that makes people think, oh, I see, you're trying to get me to think about ethics, you're trying to make me act more ethically, well, you've just made people see ethics relevant to the situation, and that may already go a long way. So that could be part of why these interventions work. I'm just speculating here. We need data to test these ideas, but I think it's a very good question.
So Dan is American, but I think he's talking about the Australian cricket team there. But what I would say though is kind of a slightly different answer is that there's also evidence, of course, that there's diminishing returns to each time you receive these reminders. And we certainly have evidence for that in the data collection process in terms of you keep reminding people again and again. Eventually people start to kind of just tune out to the nudges which you're getting. And I think we need much better research in kind of the marginal benefit, not just kind of the average benefit of these nudges. And across domains as well, I think. So if you get a letter from the Australian Tax Office, how does that interact with whether you've recently received a letter from your bank or from from Centrelink or whatever the case may be?
In the middle here in the white.
Hi everyone, Jonty from KPMG. Firstly, thanks everyone. I work in risk and compliance mostly, and those were fantastic talks and really relevant. Bit of a double whammy, one reflection and one question. Firstly, I think, Daniel, what you were just saying before about how when you try and, I suppose, try and catch people out for cheating or monitor them, but you end up making it more difficult for people doing the right thing. I think one area where companies aren't doing the right thing is in preventing piracy. By making software, games, movies a lot more difficult for people to get legally, which just means that people will do more of it. Secondly, a question around the, I guess, potential contradiction in how you were saying that people, when they reflect back on past moral behaviours, they may be more likely to act immorally later. But there's also research saying that people tend to try and maintain their self-concept. So reminding them of previous times may also prompt them to want to continue that on. I believe you hinted at it when you were talking about reminding them of their moral commitments rather than past behaviours. Could you please expand on that and what maybe an intervention to remind them of their moral commitments would look like?
Yeah, thanks a lot for asking that question. I mean, unfortunately, the short answer is that the research just isn't there yet. We haven't really nailed this question of when do prior good deeds lead to more good deeds and when do they lead to more bad deeds. And it's kind of embarrassing that the field hasn't nailed this because it's really a fundamental question. Now, even though we haven't nailed it as a field, I can give you some speculation that's very informed by data. So the answer seems to depend on how people think about their past good deeds, what it signals. And past deeds can signal one of two things. They can signal, I'm committed to a moral goal. I'm committed to being a good individual. I care really deeply about being virtuous in this particular area. And when those prior good deeds kind of change your self-concept like that or focus you on your commitments, good leads to good. Right? Just as you say, people are motivated to maintain a consistent self-concept. They don't want to feel hypocritical and contradict that. By contrast, when past good deeds are thought of as evidence of progress towards your moral goal. Look at how far I've come. I was down here and now I'm here. That's when moral licensing should occur, right? It allows people to tick the box and move on. So we're pretty confident about that finding in the field. We're less confident about what are the triggers or the levers that lead people to perceive their prior behavior as progress versus commitment. But I think this has important implications for how you frame interventions or efforts towards getting to a goal that might be considered virtuous. Take, for example, an organization that wants to diversify on some social dimension. You could say, as an organization, we are really committed to diversity as a principle of justice, as an ethical principle. We all want to get on board with this. And I would not predict that that would have a licensing effect. I would predict that that would motivate people to pursue more diversity goals. Another thing you could say is, look at this. We were completely homogenous 10 years ago. And now look, I don't know, we used to be almost entirely male, and now 30% of our workforce is female. Well, that's more about goal progress. And that's the kind of framing that I would worry about. I would think that that would be more likely to have a licensing effect.
We might go over here.
Thanks for the presentations. My name is Ray Zhang, and I work in Prime Minister and Cabinet. Dan, just in terms of your studies, I'm interested in how, I suppose, how do you create enduring behavioral change? And just in terms of your study around bias, when you ask people, whether they voted John Kerry or Obama, I was just wondering whether there's been any studies around when people realize who they are and when you put a mirror in front of them, is there an enduring behavior change when you become aware of kind of your own inherent biases?
Yeah. Thanks. There are definitely studies in the literature showing that when people are made more self-aware, they tend to stick more closely to their ethical principles. The idea is that if you're literally viewing your own reflection, it's harder to affirmatively answer the question, can I do what I want without feeling like a bad person? Just become more self-aware. My understanding is that some of those original studies, people are having trouble reproducing those findings. I'm not 100% sure about that. And if that is the case, it's a little unclear what it means. Were the original findings false positives? Have people changed in their thinking about this kind of thing? Societies change over time. Yeah, I'm not totally sure on what those newer studies look at. But thanks.
I believe we had one just here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Naomi from Department of Human Services. I work in welfare, compliance and fraud. We're moving away from a world where we're reliant on self-reporting to get welfare payments right. Instead, now we can go directly to universities, employers, banks, and get the data we need. So essentially, we're trying to remove the opportunity for non-compliance. When we've rolled out these programs on a small scale, there's been quite a bit of outcry from the public that the government can't get this right, it's wrong, even in the face of evidence that the data is correct. And there may have been some compliance problems in the past. How do you build trust from the public that programs like this, where you can try and remove the opportunity for non-compliance, are actually accurate and correct?
We might start.
Yeah, I think as was mentioned by the keynote, I guess transparency and being very clear about how the models were designed. I think also people quite justifiably don't necessarily want their individual case to be judged by a human, but want some human oversight of the model and what comes from it. So I think my understanding of where there's kind of been a bit of a pushback is not when kind of analytics is used, but when only analytics is used, and that lack of human oversight. And I think the other thing is, I think people kind of assume what people assume about how their data is used isn't necessarily reflective of what actually is being used. And I think people do assume that more data has been used in the past than hasn't been. So I think reflecting on people's perceptions might help to get more of an accurate view and an acceptance of using these types of techniques.
And I guess in a tax perspective, we actually still give people that ability to make a choice and change information, for example, when it's being pre-filled, or answer to a debt that we assess or something like that. They still have the ability to object and that kind of thing. So people still have an individual ability to do something if they do disagree.
Other questions? We've probably got time for a couple more still. Right here.
Hi, Anna Aquilina with PwC. It's actually more of a personal question for the ATO, and just wondering if, perhaps a cheeky question, if you're going to flip the reminders as well. So you said through data analytics you can detect if a certain group, compared to a certain group, individuals are trying to claim too much. I know for me personally, I've never claimed probably half of what I could.
Yeah.
So are you going to flip it and say, look, compared to a statistical cohort, you're not claiming, perhaps you should have a look at what you could claim?
You should be looking at what you can do.
It would change the reputation, perhaps, of the ATO.
This is true. I haven't actually heard of that being on our forward work program just yet. I guess what we look at is the risk to revenue and the risk to compliance. So we look at the risks first, and that's what we try and address. But apart from that, I mean, we do have a deductions app, actually, which I was just told today by someone not from the ATO. That is actually quite useful. And yeah, I guess we try to let people know that they are entitled to deduction, potentially that form is open for them to fill in if there is something that they can claim and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Hi, so thanks very much for some very interesting presentations. So my name's Peter Slattery. I work with BehaviourWorks Australia, and I'm very interested in this area of effective altruism, which I don't know if any of you have ever heard about, but it's all how you can use your resources as effectively as possible to make the world a better place. So as you can imagine, I'm quite interested in morals and what's morally right and so on. So one question that came to mind as a result of this being at this session was I was thinking about whether there's some sort of scale to measure people's sense of moral obligation, whether this exists in the literature, and whether it would be possible to track this within society, to see whether, for example, I would expect, we'd want to test it, that people's sense of moral obligation predicts the amount that they'll cheat in cases where there's, I suppose, no adverse outcome other than how they're going to feel about themselves, and whether it seems like a good idea to sort of see how that differs between groups and societies and so on, and any thoughts that you have on that.
Speak to that. There's a scale that was published in 2002 by Carl Aquino and his colleague Americus Reed called the Self-Importance of Moral Identity Scale. If you want to talk about it offline, come up to me afterwards and I can tell you a little bit about the findings from the literature. But it basically measures how important is it to you personally to be moral, and also separately, how important is it to you personally to appear moral to other people. And as you can imagine, people with scores on those different scales act differently in different situations. So we can talk offline.
So one more question, just up the back here.
Hi, Amy Arbery from the Department of Environment and Energy. So a lot of what our department does is work with organisations who are required to report or respond in some way. So a lot of our questions around compliance are around how to get organisations to be compliant versus an individual. Have you guys come across anything or have any thoughts around, I mean, humans are humans, but ideas around morality and compliance when you're representing an organisation versus representing yourself personally?
So we, with the ATO, ran a trial which was targeted towards businesses, and we found much less of an effect of kind of leveraging social norms on business taxpayers compared to kind of personal taxpayers. And I think that really gets to that point about what's, I mean, that's partly could have something to do with the information which those businesses had available to them, but also the extent to which they're representing themselves as opposed to representing the business as a whole. So I think there is, when we looked at it, there wasn't a lot of literature, but literature does suggest that that some of the nudges are less likely to have that effect on organisations as opposed to individuals.
I guess I would be looking for research that I'm not aware of yet, but more into how companies act when you're talking about their community perceptions as opposed to potentially like their actual morality. So how, again, do they appear to the community? Maybe not how they feel personally because it's a business.
With regards to moral licensing, there's a concern in organizations that people not only use their own good deeds as a license, but they use other people's good deeds as a license. It's a phenomenon called vicarious moral licensing. And it works when the person who does the good deeds is a member of your group and you identify strongly with the group. So for example, if you have a tightly knit organization with strong senses of belonging, I would worry about this effect occurring. Caveat, this effect hasn't actually been tested in organizational contexts. It comes more from laboratory studies with other sorts of groups, but I would still be concerned about it in organizations.
Okay. And with that, I won't hold you up for lunch any longer. I just ask that you join me in thanking our panel one more time.